Ed Sullivan named the 8 bastard guests he banned for life. For 23 years, Ed Sullivan's stone face and stiff delivery welcomed America into his really big shoe each Sunday night. Behind that famously expressionless exterior, however, lurked something few viewers ever witnessed: a volcanic temper that could erupt with career-ending consequences for performers who dared to cross him. Ed Sullivan created careers with a single invitation and destroyed them just as quickly with a ban, revealed a former CBS executive who worked closely with the variety show host during the 1960s. He understood his power: 60 million Americans watching every Sunday night. That was practically the entire television audience. One appearance could make you a star, and one misstep could make you persona non grata, not just on his show, but across the entire entertainment industry. While audiences at home saw Sullivan as the somewhat awkward but harmless curator of American pop culture, those who worked with him knew a different side: a man who demanded absolute control over his program and who viewed any challenge to his authority as a personal betrayal worthy of swift and permanent punishment. Ed wore 2 faces, explained a stage manager who spent a decade working on the show. There was the public Sullivan, stiff, formal, a bit uncomfortable on camera. Then there was the backstage Sullivan, the one performers feared. He ran that show like a dictator. His word was absolute law. And when someone broke that law, the punishment wasn't a warning or a second chance. It was career execution. Tonight we're revealing the 8 performers who committed what Sullivan considered the ultimate sin, defying his explicit instructions on live television, and consequently finding themselves permanently exiled from the nation's most prestigious variety show. These weren't simple misunderstandings or artistic differences. They were dramatic confrontations between ambitious performers and television's most powerful cultural gatekeeper, played out both on-screen and in explosive backstage showdowns. But first, we need to understand the rock and roll rebellion that pushed Sullivan to his breaking point, when one of the 1960s most provocative frontmen decided that artistic integrity mattered more than pleasing television's most powerful man. When you stray, no one remembers your name. The Doors, Morrison's deliberate defiance. September 17th, 1967. The Doors were scheduled to perform their hit Light My Fire on The Ed Sullivan Show, a career-making opportunity for any band. Backstage, just minutes before the live broadcast, a CBS producer approached the group with a demand directly from Sullivan himself: change the line, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher," to something less suggestive of drug use. The band nodded agreeably, seemingly understanding that on Sullivan's show, his rules were absolute. Jim Morrison, the charismatic and unpredictable frontman, gave no indication that he planned anything other than compliance. But the moment the red light went on and the cameras rolled, Morrison stared directly into the lens and defiantly sang the original lyrics, emphasizing the word higher with unmistakable intention. Ed asked Morrison not to say, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher," recalled a stagehand who witnessed both the performance and its aftermath. When Morrison sang it anyway, live, you could see Sullivan's face change instantly. He had this sixth sense about when he was being deliberately disobeyed. His expression went from neutral to this cold fury in a heartbeat. Everyone backstage who knew Ed immediately recognized that look. It meant someone was about to be banished forever. The performance continued without interruption. Sullivan was too much of a professional to create an on-air incident. But the moment the Doors finished their song and the show cut to commercial, the controlled chaos of a typical television production gave way to something far more intense. Sullivan exploded backstage, continued the stagehand. He charged directly at Morrison, jabbing his finger like a weapon, and said, "You'll never be on this show again. You're banned." Morrison just smiled this lazy, taunting smile that made Sullivan even angrier. Their producer tried to intervene, explaining that Jim had been nervous and forgotten the change, but Sullivan wasn't buying it. He just kept repeating, "That's it. You're finished here." That was deliberate. What made Sullivan particularly furious wasn't just the defiance of his authority, but the calculated way Morrison had executed it. Rather than refusing the change beforehand, which would have allowed Sullivan to cancel the performance or prepare an alternative, Morrison had pretended to agree and then deliberately blindsided the host on live television, making Sullivan feel that he'd lost control of his own show. Ed hated being disobeyed, and Morrison never cared, observed a CBS executive familiar with the incident. It was a perfect collision of opposites. Sullivan, the ultimate controller who viewed his show as a carefully curated presentation to American families, versus Morrison, the provocateur who believed art should disturb the comfortable. The conflict was probably inevitable, given their fundamentally opposed worldviews. The Doors guitarist Robbie Krieger later confirmed that the defiance was indeed deliberate, revealing that as soon as the producer left their dressing room after delivering Sullivan's demand, Morrison turned to his bandmates and declared, "We're not changing a thing." The other band members, while concerned about potentially damaging their career, ultimately deferred to their frontman's judgment. For Morrison, it was about more than just those few words, explained a music historian who has studied the incident. It was about rejecting the sanitized, corporate-controlled version of rock music that Sullivan represented. By refusing to change those lyrics, Morrison was making a statement about artistic integrity that perfectly aligned with the Doors' countercultural identity. Sullivan's band had minimal impact on the Doors' career trajectory. They were already ascending rapidly, and alternative television opportunities quickly presented themselves. But the incident became legendary within the music industry as an example of a performer prioritizing artistic principles over career pragmatism, even at the risk of alienating the most powerful man in television. What's fascinating is that Morrison seemed to understand the exchange he was making, noted the historian. He was trading one valuable television appearance for something potentially more valuable to a rock band in the late 1960s, countercultural credibility. Being banned by Ed Sullivan almost became a badge of honor for certain artists. It signified that you weren't willing to compromise your art for mainstream acceptance. For Sullivan, however, the incident represented something far more personal, a direct challenge to his authority on his own program. In private conversations after the show, Sullivan reportedly expressed particular anger at being set up by Morrison's false compliance, viewing it not as an artistic statement, but as a deliberately disrespectful ambush. Sullivan told his producer afterward, "I can handle someone refusing my rules, but not someone lying to my face and then making me look foolish on my own show," revealed an associate who worked closely with Sullivan. That combination, deception followed by public defiance, was what earned the Doors their permanent ban. Had Morrison simply refused the change beforehand, there might have been a different outcome. Perhaps no performance, but not necessarily a lifetime ban. While the Doors' confrontation with Sullivan has become the most famous such incident, it wasn't the first time a rock and roll pioneer had found themselves permanently exiled from the Sullivan stage for challenging the host's authority. A decade earlier, another groundbreaking musician made a similar choice between artistic integrity and Sullivan's rules, with equally permanent consequences. Bo Diddley. One song, one ego, one instant blacklist. November 20th, 1955. Rock and roll was still in its infancy when Bo Diddley arrived at CBS Studio 50 for his appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. As an African-American performer getting a shot on national television at a time when racial segregation was still legally enforced across much of America, the opportunity represented a potential breakthrough to the mainstream audience that could transform his career. During rehearsals, Sullivan's producers were explicit. Diddley was to perform Tennessee Ernie Ford's recent hit, 16 Tons, a song Diddley hadn't chosen and that bore little resemblance to his own pioneering rock and roll style. Nevertheless, the producers insisted this was what Sullivan wanted, and in the world of 1950s television, particularly for black performers seeking mainstream exposure, questioning such decisions wasn't considered an option. Told to play a cover of 16 Tons, explained a CBS stagehand who was present that night. But when the red light came on and they introduced him, Bo launched straight into Bo Diddley, his own signature song with that famous beat. The control room went into absolute panic. Sullivan, who was watching from the wings, turned this shade of purple I'd never seen on a human being before. Everyone knew immediately that something terrible had just happened. For the television audience at home, the performance seemed normal enough, a dynamic rock and roll number from an exciting new talent. But backstage, Sullivan was livid at what he perceived as a deliberate act of insubordination that had made him lose control of his carefully planned program. Sullivan felt publicly humiliated and banned him on the spot, recalled a production assistant who witnessed the aftermath. The moment Bo walked off stage, Sullivan was waiting. He didn't yell, which was almost worse. In this ice-cold voice, he said, "You won't ever do that again. Not on my show. You're finished here." Bo tried to explain that there had been a misunderstanding, that he thought they wanted him to do his hit song, but Sullivan wasn't interested in explanations. In his mind, his explicit instructions had been deliberately ignored. The misunderstanding, if indeed it was one, may have stemmed from the introduction Sullivan gave Diddley on air. Rather than introducing him as planned to perform 16 tons, Sullivan actually said, "Now we have Bo Diddley with his song, Bo Diddley." This confusing introduction has led some music historians to suggest that Diddley was legitimately confused about what he was supposed to perform. "One song, one ego, one instant blacklist," observed a music journalist who has researched the incident extensively. The truth of what actually happened that night is still debated. Did Diddley deliberately defy Sullivan's instructions? Was there genuine confusion about what song he was supposed to perform? Or did Sullivan's producers fail to clearly communicate the plan to Diddley? Whatever the reality, the outcome was the same. One of rock and roll's most influential pioneers was permanently banned from television's biggest stage. The racial dynamics of the incident can't be ignored. As an African-American performer in the mid-1950s, Diddley had far less power to challenge white producers' decisions than white performers might have had. The expectation that he would perform a cover song rather than his own material, essentially subordinating his artistic identity to Sullivan's preference, reflected the unequal treatment often experienced by black artists in that era. Sullivan's show deserves credit for featuring many black performers when other programs wouldn't, noted a cultural historian specializing in early television. But there was still often an expectation that these performers would accommodate themselves to what Sullivan thought his predominantly white audience wanted to see. Diddley refusing that accommodation, insisting on performing his own music his own way, represented a challenge not just to Sullivan's authority, but to the broader cultural dynamics of 1950s television. For Diddley, the ban had significant career implications. Being blacklisted from The Ed Sullivan Show meant losing access to the largest television audience in America at a crucial moment in the development of rock and roll. While his influence on the genre would ultimately be recognized as foundational, his mainstream commercial success never matched that of some contemporaries who benefited from the exposure Sullivan's show provided. Bo later said that getting banned by Sullivan cost him at least $1 million in his career. The journalist continued, "That might be an exaggeration, but there's no question that in the 1950s, Sullivan was the primary gateway to mainstream American awareness for musicians. Being denied that platform certainly impacted Diddley's commercial prospects, even as his artistic influence continued to grow among other musicians." Sullivan's swift and permanent punishment of Diddley established a pattern that would repeat throughout his tenure as television's most powerful cultural gatekeeper. Artists who challenged his authority, whether through deliberate defiance or unfortunate misunderstanding, found themselves immediately and permanently banished from his stage. What made Sullivan's ban so significant wasn't just that you couldn't appear on his show again, explained the CBS executive. It was that his influence extended far beyond his own program. Other shows and producers were reluctant to book someone Sullivan had blacklisted, fearing they might damage their relationship with CBS or with Sullivan personally. A ban didn't just close one door. It often closed many doors throughout the industry. While musicians like Diddley and the Doors found themselves exiled for challenging Sullivan's musical control, other performers discovered that even unintentional gestures could be interpreted as disrespect, with equally permanent consequences.
Talking to himself lately. I stopped listening to him too. I've always wondered why makes a guy walk around laughing all the time.
Jackie Mason, The Finger That Ended a Career. October 18th, 1964. Comedian Jackie Mason was midway through his second appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show when disaster struck. Sullivan, standing off stage, began signaling Mason to wrap up his routine because the program was running behind schedule. Mason, seeing the frantic gestures from the corner of his eye but not wanting to interrupt his flow, acknowledged Sullivan with a quick hand motion of his own and continued his act. That hand gesture would become one of the most controversial moments in Sullivan Show history, and would effectively derail Mason's rising career for nearly a decade. Allegedly gave Ed the middle finger on live TV after being rushed off stage, explained a camera operator who captured the infamous moment. I say allegedly because what actually happened and what Sullivan believed happened were two very different things. I was operating the camera pointed at Jackie, and from my perspective, he just made a quick gesture to acknowledge Ed's signals, holding up his hand with his fingers slightly spread. But Sullivan, from his angle off stage, was convinced Mason had deliberately flipped him off on national television. The misunderstanding might have been resolved after the show, but Sullivan's fury left no room for explanation. In his mind, Mason had committed the ultimate act of disrespect, not just defying his timing signals, but responding with an obscene gesture that humiliated him in front of his audience. Claimed it was just hand gestures. Ed didn't buy it, recalled a producer who witnessed the aftermath. The moment Mason walked off stage, Sullivan confronted him, literally shaking with anger. Mason tried to explain that he was just acknowledging the time signals, that he would never give someone the finger on television. But Sullivan was beyond reasoning. He kept saying, "I saw what I saw. You're finished on this show. Do you understand me? Finished." What made the incident particularly destructive to Mason's career was Sullivan's decision to escalate the conflict beyond a private disagreement. The following week, Sullivan took the extraordinary step of making a public announcement on his program, telling his 60 million viewers that Mason had made an obscene gesture and had been banned from the show, essentially warning the American public that this performer had exhibited unacceptable behavior. "The only finger Ed gave back was the one pointing to the door," observed the producer. But it wasn't enough for Sullivan to simply ban Mason from his show. By making that public announcement the following week, he was effectively telling the entire entertainment industry that Mason was persona non grata. For a comedian in the mid-1960s, that kind of public condemnation from Sullivan was career poison. Mason, desperate to clear his name, took the unprecedented step of filing a libel lawsuit against Sullivan, seeking $3 million in damages. The suit claimed Sullivan's public accusation had devastated his career, with nightclub bookings and television appearances evaporating overnight following Sullivan's on-air condemnation. Mason later said that his income dropped from $30,000 a week to $200 a night after Sullivan's ban, noted an entertainment lawyer familiar with the case. That's not an exaggeration. Sullivan's influence was so pervasive that his public disapproval could effectively end a performer's viable career in mainstream entertainment. Mason went from being one of the hottest rising comedians in America to struggling for any bookings at all. The lawsuit dragged on for years before finally being settled out of court in 1969, with Sullivan offering a public apology and acknowledging that the gesture might have been misinterpreted. By then, however, Mason's career momentum had been completely derailed, and it would take nearly a decade before he would regain his previous level of success. What made the Mason incident particularly tragic was that it appears to have been a genuine misunderstanding rather than deliberate defiance, reflected a television historian who has studied The Sullivan Show extensively. Unlike Morrison or Diddley, who made conscious choices to disobey Sullivan's rules, Mason seems to have been caught in an unfortunate misperception that spiraled out of control due to Sullivan's hair-trigger temper and unwillingness to consider alternative explanations. The incident revealed a particularly dangerous aspect of Sullivan's power, his ability to not only ban performers from his own show, but to effectively blacklist them throughout the industry through his public condemnations. This amplification of Sullivan's personal grievances into industry-wide exclusion demonstrated the extraordinary concentrated power he wielded over entertainment careers. Sullivan operated like the Supreme Court of American entertainment without any appeals process, observed the historian. His judgments were swift, severe, and often irrevocable, and because of his unique position as television's most powerful cultural gatekeeper, those judgments extended far beyond his own program to influence how a performer was perceived and received throughout the entire entertainment industry. While the Mason controversy stemmed from a misunderstanding, other Sullivan bans resulted from more deliberate artistic choices that challenged the host's control, including a young rock pioneer whose subtle act of rebellion earned Sullivan's permanent disapproval.
How old are all these fellas?
Well, there's 218, 120, and I'm 21.
Where do you come from?
Buddy Holly, The Quiet Rebellion that Sullivan couldn't forgive. January 26, 1958. Buddy Holly and the Crickets were scheduled to make their second appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, building on the success of their first performance months earlier. This time, however, there was tension before they even took the stage. Sullivan's producers had instructed the band to perform to a pre-recorded track rather than playing live, a common but controversial practice designed to ensure technical perfection at the expense of authentic performance. The Crickets were told to sing to a pre-recorded track, explained a sound engineer who worked that night. This was standard procedure for Sullivan with certain acts, especially rock and roll bands that he didn't entirely trust to deliver a clean, problem-free performance. But Buddy and the boys were serious musicians who prided themselves on their live performances. They viewed this demand as an insult to their professionalism. Rather than overtly refusing, which would likely have resulted in their appearance being canceled, Holly chose a more subtle form of rebellion. The band agreed to the pre-recorded track, but when they took the stage, they deliberately performed with a casual indifference that made it obvious they weren't actually playing. Holly also made small but noticeable changes to the lyrics of "Oh Boy," nothing objectionable, but enough to make it clear this was not the exact version that had been approved. They refused. Did it live? And Buddy sarcastically messed with the lyrics, continued the engineer. It wasn't an aggressive defiance like Morrison would do years later. It was a much more subtle "screw you" to the Sullivan production. Small lyric changes, obvious disconnect between their movements and the sounds being heard. This general attitude of, we're just going through the motions because you won't let us actually perform. But Sullivan picked up on it immediately. Backstage after the performance, Sullivan made his displeasure clear. While he didn't create a public spectacle as he had with Jackie Mason, he informed Holly's management that the Crickets would not be invited back to his program, a significant blow for a rising act still working to cement their place in the mainstream. Ed reportedly called him a punk with no class, recalled a production assistant who overheard the conversation. Sullivan was especially angry because he felt Holly had been deliberately disrespectful, not through outright defiance, but through this sarcastic, passive-aggressive performance that made Sullivan's production decisions look foolish. He told Holly's manager, "He thinks he's too big for my show already. Let him find out if that's true." What made Sullivan's reaction particularly noteworthy was its severity relative to Holly's subtle rebellion. While performers like The Doors or Bo Diddley had engaged in overt defiance of Sullivan's instructions, Holly's resistance had been far more restrained, yet Sullivan's response was equally definitive. Talented? Yes. Trusted? Never again, observed a music producer familiar with the incident. Sullivan operated on a principle of absolute authority. From his perspective, any challenge to that authority, whether dramatic or subtle, warranted the same punishment. Holly's crime wasn't creating a scandal, it was showing disrespect for Sullivan's production decisions. And in Sullivan's world, that was sufficient for permanent banishment. For Holly, the ban represented a loss of valuable mainstream exposure at a critical point in his career. While he would continue to find success on other programs and through recordings, The Sullivan Show remained the premier television showcase for musical talent, and losing access to that platform created significant promotional challenges. The sad irony is that Holly died just over a year later in that tragic plane crash, noted the music historian. So the ban, which might have been temporary, had Holly's career continued for decades like some of his contemporaries, instead became one of the final chapters in his too short story. Sullivan never had to confront the question of whether to eventually forgive Holly, as the young musician's promising career was cut short just as it was reaching its potential. Sullivan's reaction to Holly revealed a particularly personal dimension to his banning decisions. It wasn't simply about maintaining the technical quality of his show or protecting his audience from potentially offensive content. It was about demanding complete deference to his authority as the program's namesake and creative director. Sullivan took these perceived slights very personally, explained the CBS executive. He viewed his show as an extension of himself, almost like it was his home that he was inviting these performers into. And if you didn't show proper respect in his home, if you challenged his rules or made him look foolish, he would throw you out and never let you back in. It wasn't business for him, it was deeply personal. While Holly's subtle rebellion and Sullivan's dramatic response reflected the growing tensions between the old guard of entertainment and the emerging rock and roll culture, other bans resulted from more practical concerns about performers whose unpredictable behavior threatened the smooth operation of television's most precisely managed variety show.
By my mom, mainly, to not take advantage of
Sly Stone, The Chaos, Sullivan Couldn't Control. February 1970. Sly and the Family Stone were at the height of their popularity, having recently released their groundbreaking album, Stand, and delivered a legendary performance at Woodstock. When they were booked for The Ed Sullivan Show, it represented a significant booking coup for a program working to stay relevant amid the rapidly evolving musical landscape of the late 1960s and early 70s, But alarm bells began ringing for the Sullivan production team the moment Sly Stone arrived at the studio for rehearsal. Hours late, visibly impaired, and accompanied by an entourage that seemed more interested in partying than in preparing for a national television appearance, showed up high and incoherent, remembered a stage manager who worked that chaotic day. From the moment he walked in, or more accurately, was practically carried in by his entourage, the entire production staff knew we were in trouble. He couldn't follow basic directions. He kept wandering off between takes. The band couldn't get through a complete run-through because Sly would suddenly change the arrangement midway through or just stop playing entirely to make some incomprehensible point. As rehearsals continued to deteriorate, Sullivan himself came down to the stage, something he rarely did during technical preparations, to assess the situation. What he witnessed was a performer so impaired that completing a live broadcast performance seemed increasingly doubtful. Missed cues, delayed filming, continued the stage manager. Sullivan stood in the wings watching this disaster unfold, and you could see him calculating whether this act, no matter how popular, was worth the risk to his show's reputation for professional excellence. After about 20 minutes, he'd seen enough. He pulled the producer aside and said, "Get them out of here. They're not going on my program in this condition." Sullivan's decision to ban Sly and the Family Stone wasn't primarily about creative differences or perceived disrespect, though Stone's complete disregard for the show's schedule certainly factored into the host's thinking. It was more fundamentally about Sullivan's insistence on maintaining complete control over his broadcast and his unwillingness to risk unpredictable, potentially embarrassing moments on live television. Ed was livid at the unprofessionalism, recalled the CBS executive who had to manage the fallout from the cancellation. Sullivan built his reputation on running the tightest ship in television. His show was meticulously planned, rehearsed, and executed. Someone like Sly Stone, talented as he was, represented everything Sullivan couldn't abide: unpredictability, unreliability, and a complete disregard for the mechanical necessities of producing a live television program. The decision to ban Stone and his band was particularly significant given their immense popularity at that moment. Few acts in 1970 had a hotter commercial profile or more cultural relevance, and canceling their appearance represented a substantial rating sacrifice. That Sullivan was willing to forfeit those potential viewers rather than risk an unpredictable on-air incident demonstrated his prioritization of control over commerce. He said rock was loud, but this was chaos, observed the executive. Sullivan wasn't categorically opposed to rock and roll or counterculture music. He had featured the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Jefferson Airplane, plenty of acts associated with the youth movement. What he opposed was chaos. Any performer, no matter how popular, who threatened the orderly execution of his program would find themselves quickly excised. For Sly and the Family Stone, the band had minimal impact on their immediate career trajectory. They were already established stars with plenty of alternative platforms. But it did represent a lost opportunity to reach Sullivan's massive mainstream audience at the height of their creative and commercial powers. The Sly situation was different from some other Sullivan bands, in that it wasn't about specific content or deliberate defiance of rules, noted a music historian specializing in the period. It was about Sullivan's fundamental insistence on reliability and control. Acts could be provocative within carefully defined boundaries, but they had to be professionally dependable. Sly crossed the line not by what he planned to perform, but by being incapable of delivering any coherent performance at all. Sullivan's decision also reflected his understanding of the unique pressures of live television in that era. Without the safety net of digital editing or significant tape delay, any on-air mishap would be immediately visible to tens of millions of viewers, potentially damaging not just that night's broadcast, but the show's carefully cultivated reputation for polished performances. Sullivan built his empire on predictability, explained a television historian. Viewers tuned in every Sunday knowing exactly what they would get: a professionally executed variety show with diverse acts all operating within clear parameters of family-friendly entertainment. Someone like Sly Stone in that condition represented an unacceptable risk to that formula, a potential moment of televised chaos that could undermine the very foundation of Sullivan's brand. While musical acts most frequently ran afoul of Sullivan's strict requirements, actors occasionally found themselves permanently banished as well, particularly those whose behavior Sullivan perceived as disrespectful to him personally or to the professional standards he demanded.
He's going to be laughed at. He's afraid. I said, that's nonsense. Come on, Sarah, let's do it. We do it.
Robert Mitchum, Hollywood tough guy meets television's toughest boss. Robert Mitchum was Hollywood royalty, the quintessential tough guy whose laconic style and effortless cool had made him one of the industry's most reliable leading men. When he was booked on The Ed Sullivan Show to promote his latest film, the production team expected the typical promotional appearance, a brief interview, perhaps a clip from the movie, and the standard celebrity host pleasantries. What they got instead was a collision between two immovable forces: Mitchum's infamous indifference to Hollywood protocol and Sullivan's insistence on complete deference to his authority. Smelled like alcohol, refused stage directions, recalled a production assistant who witnessed the disastrous rehearsal. Mitchum showed up with this attitude of complete disinterest in the whole process. When our director tried to give him basic guidance about where to stand and how the interview would flow, Mitchum just stared at him with those hooded eyes and drawled, "You worry about your job, Chief, and I'll worry about mine." The temperature in the studio dropped about 20 degrees after that exchange. As rehearsals continued, Mitchum's casual disregard for the show's procedures evolved into more pointed mockery of Sullivan himself. When the host arrived to briefly review the planned segment, Mitchum began subtly imitating Sullivan's famously stiff posture and robotic delivery, not overtly enough to provoke an immediate confrontation, but unmistakably meant to amuse himself at the host's expense. Sarcastic in rehearsal, and openly mocked Sullivan's stiffness, continued the assistant. At first it was just little things, exaggerated hand gestures mimicking Sullivan's awkward movements, repeating phrases in that distinctive Sullivan cadence. But it became increasingly obvious that Mitchum was entertaining himself by making fun of Ed, and several crew members were struggling not to laugh. When Sullivan noticed what was happening, his expression changed instantly from professional politeness to absolute fury. For Sullivan, Mitchum's behavior represented a particularly personal affront. Where other band performers had challenged his professional authority or creative decisions, Mitchum was directly mocking Sullivan himself. His physical mannerisms and speaking style that had long been sources of private insecurity for the host. Ed allegedly said, "He's drunk and he thinks it's funny. He's out," remembered the CBS executive who had to manage the sudden programming change. Sullivan pulled the producer aside and said he wanted Mitchum removed from the show immediately. When the producer pointed out that they would need to find a last-minute replacement, Sullivan reportedly said, "I don't care if we have to fill the time with a test pattern. That man is not appearing on my program." Mitchum's reaction to being dismissed from the show only reinforced Sullivan's decision. Rather than apologizing or attempting to salvage the appearance, the actor reportedly shrugged, said, "Suit yourself," and walked out of the studio with the same casual indifference he had displayed throughout the rehearsal. Mitchum didn't care. Ed cared enough for both of them, observed the executive. That was the fundamental disconnect. To Mitchum, the Ed Sullivan Show was just another promotional obligation his studio had arranged, one he clearly didn't take very seriously. But to Sullivan, his program was a cultural institution that demanded appropriate respect and professionalism from every guest, regardless of their Hollywood status. The band had minimal impact on Mitchum's career. He was already a firmly established star with a dedicated audience, and television appearances were a relatively minor component of his professional obligations. For Sullivan, however, the incident represented another example of his willingness to prioritize his personal sense of dignity over potential ratings or celebrity drawing power. Sullivan operated from a position where he believed his show was doing celebrities a favor by featuring them, not the other way around, explained the television historian. That perspective gave him the confidence to exclude even major stars like Mitchum if he felt they hadn't shown proper respect for his program. In an era when most shows would tolerate almost any behavior from a big enough star, Sullivan's willingness to uphold his personal standards, regardless of a performer's status, was genuinely unusual. This prioritization of personal dignity over star power reflected Sullivan's broader understanding of his show's unique position in American culture. As television's longest-running and most-watched variety program, The Ed Sullivan Show could afford to exclude individual celebrities, no matter how popular, if Sullivan believed they undermined the program's carefully cultivated reputation for professionalism and respectability. What's fascinating about the Mitchum ban is that it wasn't about anything that would have been visible to viewers at home, noted the historian. It was entirely about backstage behavior that the audience would never have witnessed. That reveals something important about Sullivan's banning decisions. They weren't just about protecting his audience from potentially offensive content, they were about demanding a certain standard of professional respect behind the scenes as well. While performers like Mitchum found themselves banned for personal disrespect toward Sullivan, others were excluded not for anything they did on his program, but for public behavior elsewhere that Sullivan deemed incompatible with his show's family-friendly image.
I've convinced you. I don't know, I get so dramatic about it. You're better off alone, man. I got it.
Lenny Bruce, the comic too hot for Sunday night. Unlike most entries on Sullivan's blacklist, groundbreaking comedian Lenny Bruce never actually appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show before being banned. His exclusion came not from any direct confrontation with Sullivan or violation of the host's rules, but from Sullivan's preemptive judgment that Bruce's controversial comedy and growing reputation for obscenity made him fundamentally unsuitable for mainstream family television. Never even made it to air, explained the talent coordinator who had initially suggested booking Bruce in the late 1950s before his material became more explicitly provocative. Sullivan was always cautious about comedians. He had experienced too many incidents where apparently safe comics had gone off script and included material he considered inappropriate. But with Lenny Bruce, it wasn't even a close decision. The moment Bruce's name was suggested at a booking meeting, Sullivan shut it down immediately. Sullivan's concern wasn't unfounded. By the early 1960s, Bruce had become notorious for his arrests on obscenity charges, with performances that directly addressed topics like religion, politics, sex, and race in terms far more explicit than anything permitted on network television. For a program that positioned itself as appropriate for all ages and all regions of America, Bruce represented an unacceptable risk. After his arrest record and reputation grew, Sullivan banned him permanently, recalled the CBS executive. It wasn't just that Sullivan personally disapproved of Bruce's material, though he certainly did. It was that Sullivan understood his show's unique position as one of the few television programs that entire families watched together, from grandparents to young children. Booking someone with Bruce's controversial reputation would have risked alienating a significant portion of that multi-generational audience. Sullivan's assessment of Bruce went beyond professional caution into personal moral judgment. In private conversations, the host expressed unambiguous disapproval of Bruce's comedy and its challenges to conventional social standards. Called him a filthy disgrace to television, remembered someone who worked closely with Sullivan during that period. Ed wasn't just making a business decision to protect his ratings, he was making a moral judgment about Bruce's entire approach to comedy. Sullivan genuinely believed that entertainment should uplift rather than challenge audiences, should reinforce mainstream values rather than question them. Someone like Bruce, who built his entire act around dismantling those comfortable assumptions, represented everything Sullivan opposed philosophically. What made the Bruce ban particularly significant was that it revealed the extent of Sullivan's cultural conservatism beneath his occasional bookings of more progressive performers. While Sullivan had earned a reputation for featuring black performers when many shows wouldn't, and for introducing Americans to the Beatles and other youth-oriented acts, these decisions reflected pragmatic recognition of cultural trends rather than personal affinity for social change. Ed feared the FCC, and Lenny guaranteed letters, observed the television historian. Sullivan was fundamentally a cultural traditionalist who happened to be an extremely savvy businessman. He understood the commercial necessity of featuring acts like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones as they gained popularity, but his personal values remained much more conventional. Bruce represented a direct challenge to those conventional values, not just through occasional provocative language, but through his entire philosophical approach to comedy as a tool for social criticism. For Bruce, exclusion from The Ed Sullivan Show represented just one of many mainstream platforms closed to him as his legal troubles mounted and his material became increasingly confrontational. But the ban did reflect how even in the evolving cultural landscape of the 1960s, there remained firm boundaries around what was considered acceptable for mass audience consumption. The Bruce situation differed from Sullivan's other bans in that there was no specific incident or confrontation, noted the historian. It was a preventive exclusion based on Sullivan's judgment that Bruce's entire persona was incompatible with his show's brand. In that sense, it wasn't personal in the way some other bans were, Sullivan didn't have any particular animosity toward Bruce as an individual. He simply viewed Bruce's comedy as fundamentally inappropriate for the platform he controlled. While most of Sullivan's banning decisions were permanent and absolute, our final case represents a rare instance where commercial realities ultimately forced the host to reconsider his initial judgment, though not without imposing strict conditions that revealed his continuing discomfort.
There's nothing as far as I know, no.
When you look at your opportunity to go and try to fill up the...
Elvis Presley, the temporary ban that changed television history, January 6, 1957. After 2 appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show in late 1956 that had drawn record-breaking audiences, Elvis Presley was scheduled for a 3rd and final performance as part of his contract. His previous appearances had already created controversy, with his energetic hip movements leading to complaints from religious groups and concerned parents who viewed his performance style as overly sexual and inappropriate for family viewing. Sullivan, who had initially resisted booking Presley precisely because of these concerns, had reluctantly recognized the commercial necessity of featuring the biggest star in American music. But as criticism mounted after the 2nd appearance, Sullivan made a dramatic decision that would forever change how Presley was presented on his program. Ed was furious about Elvis's vulgar gyrations, explained a camera operator who worked the fateful 3rd appearance. The instructions we received were unprecedented in the history of the show. We were explicitly told that Presley was to be filmed only from the waist up during his performance. No wide shots that showed his hips or legs were permitted under any circumstances. Sullivan had personally approved this restriction and made it clear there would be serious consequences for any crew member who violated it. This unusual filming restriction represented Sullivan's attempt to reconcile the commercial imperative of featuring Presley with his personal discomfort with the singer's performance style. By literally removing the objectionable elements from viewers' sight, Sullivan believed he could capture the ratings Presley guaranteed while still maintaining his show's family-friendly reputation. Initially said he'd never allow Elvis on the show, noted the CBS executive familiar with Sullivan's booking decisions. That initial rejection represented Sullivan's personal aesthetic judgment, but the overwhelming popularity of Presley made that position commercially untenable. Sullivan was ultimately a businessman, and the potential audience Presley could deliver simply couldn't be ignored, regardless of Sullivan's personal reservations. The waist-up filming restriction revealed Sullivan's continuing discomfort with Presley, even as commercial pressures forced him to feature the singer. It represented a compromise between Sullivan's role as cultural gatekeeper and his responsibilities as the host of a commercial television program competing for viewers in an increasingly crowded media landscape. Public pressure forced his hand, but Elvis was only shown from the waist up, observed the television historian. That visual restriction perfectly encapsulates Sullivan's approach to cultural change. He would acknowledge new trends when their popularity made them impossible to ignore, but he would try to contain and sanitize those trends to fit within his more traditional understanding of appropriate entertainment. For viewers at home, the unusual camera work created a visual disconnect that actually drew more attention to what wasn't being shown. Audiences were left to imagine what movements might be occurring below the frame, potentially making the performance seem more provocative than if it had simply been presented in full view. "He was the king of rock and the king of Ed's migraines," laughed the camera operator. The irony is that by trying to hide Presley's movements, Sullivan created this almost surreal television moment that drew even more attention to the very thing he was trying to downplay. It became one of the most discussed and remembered aspects of Presley's appearances on the show, the fact that viewers weren't allowed to see his entire body. Unlike the permanent bans Sullivan imposed on other performers, his restrictions on Presley represented a rare case where commercial considerations ultimately overruled his personal aesthetic and moral judgments. The unprecedented ratings Presley delivered simply made a complete ban commercially unviable, forcing Sullivan to find an alternative approach to managing content he personally found objectionable. "This wasn't a complete ban, but a conditional acceptance," explained the historian. It revealed the limits of Sullivan's cultural authority in the face of overwhelming public demand. With other performers, he could simply exclude them entirely if they violated his standards. With Presley, whose cultural impact was too significant to ignore, Sullivan had to settle for controlling how he was presented rather than whether he appeared at all. The Elvis episode demonstrated an important truth about Sullivan's role as cultural gatekeeper. His power, while substantial, was not absolute. Where public demand was sufficiently strong, even Sullivan had to make accommodations, finding ways to present controversial performers within parameters he could tolerate rather than excluding them entirely. The Presley situation showed where the true power ultimately resided, with the audience, concluded the executive. Sullivan could ban most performers without significant commercial consequences, but when someone achieved the level of popularity Presley had reached, even television's most powerful host had to compromise his personal standards to meet audience demand. It was a rare instance where Sullivan's cultural authority met its match in the overwhelming popular appeal of a performer he personally disapproved of.